It's my great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. There's a term in an environmental world that's a really catchy term for really catchy animals. Charismatic megafauna. So lions and tigers and bears, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, T-Rex, charismatic megafauna. I think Stewart Brand is the human equivalent of charismatic megafauna. He is a fascinating guy who's been doing things from founding the Whole Earth Catalog to creating the Long Now Foundation and a variety of things in between and continuing. Happily for us, he is not extinct, is showing no signs of becoming extinct anytime soon. And he and his wife and partner, Ryan Phelan, who's here in the audience, are the reason we're here. In the sense that I think without Stewart and Ryan, nobody except disgraced South Korean stem cell scientists would be talking about de-extinction. Revive and Restore, the organization they've created under the Long Now Foundation, has been the main force leading the discussion of de-extinction, from several workshops in conjunction with the National Geographic Society, which has also helped enormously, to the TEDx event in March. Revive and Restore has been at the forefront of pushing discussion of this issue, and Ryan and Stewart have been Revive and Restore. So it is with great pleasure that I shut up and turn you over to Stewart. You know, there aren't very many people I'd rather hear talk than myself. Stewart's one of them.
I just want to point out we are in the law school.
We have special exceptions. We have special friends of Rick here. So
right.
How do you find food?
Sound check. Can you hear me?
Not well.
Not so good. Is there a way to crank it up? Yeah. If you can crank it up while I mutter about.
the answer is maybe.
So Revive and Restore is doing a couple of things. As Hank mentioned, we've been convening a sequence of conferences. This is the first one we haven't convened, and we're really excited that that's the case. Thank you, Hank, for doing this. Thank you, Law School, for hosting it. We are pushing ahead with the passenger pigeon. Ben Novak back here in the blue shirt is leading that effort. We want to push ahead on bringing back the woolly mammoth, and we'd love to find the Ben Novak equivalent for that. In the meantime, we're mainly doing, in a sense, what you're doing here, which is trying to make sure that de-extinction, as it becomes a field, scientific discipline, that it moves forward in a responsible way. And part of what we're about is figuring out, very much in public, transparently, and in public discourse, what we mean by responsible. And part of what we're trying to do is make sure that the public discourse doesn't get simple-minded on this subject, the way it tends to get simple-minded on every subject that it possibly can. It's complicated, and the nature of the complications change over time. We'd like the public discourse to relatively keep pace with what the conservation scientists and the molecular scientists are coming up with. A few years ago, is there anybody here from the Stanford Biology Department? There's one, good. And me, that's it. I'm a product of the Stanford Biology Department back in the 1950s. Ecology has moved along since then, happy to say. But anyway, I did a book called Whole Earth Discipline 3 years ago, it came out. It basically says Anthropocene ecology, environmentalism in this century is going to be different, and it's going to be intensely pragmatic, moving on from the romantic period that it got into in the 1970s. And one of the things I wrote about in here was some of the problems of the precautionary principle when it went a little bit crazy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Because the way it tends to play out is, quote, expected benefits from any act are finite and known. quote, golden rice will prevent blindness in children. Imagined problems are infinite and unknown. Golden rice might cause poor people to stop eating green vegetables. It might lead to excess vitamin A consumption. It might be a Trojan horse for corporate takeover. It might cause who knows what problems. The apparent imbalance is treated as a contest between small and unlikely good versus large and certain harm. In this formulation, no good surprises are possible, all bad surprises are probable, and intended consequences are never what actually happens. But in reality, intended consequences are what usually happen. Surprises are balanced between good and bad, and they're relatively easy to recognize and expand on or correct as needed. So the anticipatory discourse tends to be the classic troll mode. When you see anything proposed that's kind of exciting online, and then you look at the discussion afterwards, all the trolls come out from under their bridges and say, nah, it won't work because of this, won't work because of that, forget it, and then they start insulting people. So, think about moving ahead on something I proposed in this book called the vigilance principle. And the vigilance principle supplements the precautionary principle and maybe replaces it. The way I'm thinking about it is this. Hello? Let's try that. There we come, I bet. Yes, we're live.
There's a messy desktop.
Messy desktop, I already lost the audience. Okay, cautionary vigilance. Tagline, hopes, worries, and outcomes. So just thinking about it, I'm proposing that this is something the Long Now Foundation, our parent organization, take on. The idea of cautionary vigilance is you set up an apparatus which frames up the things you want to hope and worry about in relation to, say, a new technology or new phenomenon, and set up a body of people who build the framework, the monitors. You might have a core set who do various ones of these. You have a set of people who are specific to the issue, and maybe some institutions who will help watch the thing over time, and probably some online involvement as well. And how I see the process going is, you figure out the subject, and then you start collecting what are the hopes and concerns, and you can get them from the wild, or you can just, because there's a lot of them online and elsewhere, you can figure out yourself. And then line up your hopes and concerns and start shaping them out into the arguments. So there's people who say, well, this is the hope that we want to have happen. And there's some other people who say, yeah, but it's not going to work that way. And they each have arguments. And then you'd like to declare in advance evidence that would make it clear which conjecture was right. And the same with concerns that people have. And so people, look, there's going to be a huge problem. The money that we're trying to put into elephants will all go away to these stupid mammoths, and they won't even happen. So don't do that. And there's people who take the other side and say, it doesn't actually work that way. That's a false trade-off. And the argument's played out, and you figure out the evidence. And then over time, what you want is so that framework comes out into something you can publish, and then the monitoring starts. And you set up in advance how often there's going to be a report. And as the monitoring goes along, you occasionally come up with your vigilance report on that particular subject. And one of the things that will occur is by then there will have been surprises, unexpected benefits and unexpected harms. You want to plug them into the system, readjust the issues. Some of the things will have gone away because the evidence is already in, and so you go. So let's think about the framework. The way I'm spelling out the framework is that I think it's useful to take it by stages. People tend to go to the end stage, and so the first thing they say about passenger pigeons is, oh my God, what are we going to do with 5 billion passenger pigeons? This is not actually the first real question. One, you may get no passenger pigeons, it's not a problem. May you may get just a few passenger pigeons, still no problem. You may get only 1 billion passenger pigeons, still no problem. So people imagine the thing that is most disturbing, focus on that and say don't do it. Well, by taking things in the sequence, this is why Beth Shapiro's material is so important. She focuses on the molecular biology in the case of the editing process. And that's where there's a whole lot of issues right there before you ever get to a de-extincted animal. So the way I'm proposing putting the framework is you lay out your project in sequence of its stages, and then you deal with the hopes and concerns in sequence of their consequence. Not necessarily the sequence in which people the trolls bring them up in the world, but where it completely undoes the game. Those are the things you want to look at first, because if it doesn't play out in some crucial way, then game over. You don't need to worry about all the rest. So try it with a case. This is de-extinction. I'll go into some details and see how it works. But the basic layout here, so here's stages of the project. You read and compare the genes, you edit them into a living genome. Good luck. You start getting the capture breeding, you get them back in the wild, and they thrive in the wild. That's sort of the end state that you're hoping for. And you lay it out in terms of the concerns, the arguments, and the evidence. This is an evidence-driven, time-based approach to thinking about these things. So let's look up close here. Start with the concerns, because everybody likes those. All right. Okay, early on, here we are in Beth territory. So comparing genomes, as Beth points out, look, I'm just going to take some sample of the various arguments and worries and hopes that are going to come up with de-extinction. But look, you're not going to get all the DNA. You're not going to get the heterochromatin, probably ever. They're really dense areas that are highly repetitive. And if that's the case and that's important, you're going to want to see how that plays out. But the opposite argument on that is, you know what, you don't need that. Maybe, we hope, because that will be, you'll get enough of that kind of thing in the, basically, organism that you're joining, so you don't worry about the heterochromosome in the chromatin in the passenger pigeon, because you've got plenty that'll be probably pretty operational in the band-tailed pigeon. But the evidence that you're looking for is, do the transfer genes work, and do they add up to a plausible hybrid? Likewise, start comparing the genomes of the band-tailed and the passenger pigeon, or the mammoth and the Asian elephant. There's going to be a lot of mutations that are different. And we don't know yet how many. Is it 2%? Is it 10%? Well, when you're talking 1.3 billion base pairs, that's a lot of wiggly little differences. And which ones are important? It's going to be a critical problem. So, the argument against is, especially the regulatory, the non-coding genes, how the hell are you going to know which ones are really important? You're not going to, at least for a while, be able to transfer everything over. It's just too much. So you got to be selective. On the other hand, Ben and others are saying, look, you can start to triangulate from a variety of species that are closely related to your animal, starting with a chicken, a passenger pigeon, pretty well studied. Increase the study, and you can start figuring out which are the ones you really care about. And the evidence you'll look for is, are the early minimal sets of genes working impressively, or do they just keep on failing? They will fail initially, or you'll get a partial success, and that's normal. So look over on the I hope side. Okay, you're going to read and compare genomes. Some of the science that you're hoping for is you'll be able to discover functional and regulatory differences that you compare about. This is good comparative genomics being done with some very interesting animals, one of which doesn't exist anymore. And the argument for that is that thereby you are able to know a lot more about comparative genomics generally and how evolution works in particular. This is something that the 10K Genome Project, for example, is extremely interested in. They want 10,000 genomes, including extinct ones, to do that. The argument against it is good luck with that. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of noise, and there's just too damn much noise to get enough signal out of it. Well, the evidence will be, are the scientific papers coming out, and are they good papers? And do they move the science ahead? Likewise, are we going to discover extinction vulnerabilities in these extinct animals? They are a case study, often against a closely related animal that did go extinct. Is the problem identifiable there in the genome? Were they susceptible to some disease? Did they have a genetic bottleneck issue that got them where it didn't get their close relative? And again, this knowledge ideally can be applied to endangered animals. And so you're starting to help the process of keeping endangered animals from going extinct. But, you know, it's just a conjecture. There may not be anything really there, and the evidence will come out that it's the case or not. Go down to the kind of the goal end of things. Now we're getting the animals back in the wild. And people are saying, boy, this is just what we wanted. They're keystone species. They're enriching their whole ecosystem. The passenger pigeons are bringing their dung to parts of the woods that haven't seen inches of dung in a century. And their whole ecological function resumed. And they are supremely tuned by evolution to do that. This is not some new one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people eater. This is an old hand at dealing with that particular ecosystem. And it's missed and you want it back. But you know, shifting baseline says there's creatures out there now that we know and love that have come along since this forgotten animal disappeared. And you know, what about mourning dove? The mourning doves and passenger pigeons compete. The passenger pigeons come along. They're not a game animal, at least for a while. And the mourning doves are a game animal. The hunters are going to say, what just happened? Those poor little mourning doves. There'll be, you know, television short subjects on the adorable mourning doves and how they're being defeated by these terrible passenger pigeons. Or the prey, things that eat things. The things they eat will suffer as they are eaten. And that becomes a subject. As soon as agency arrives at these things, as soon as people have done something deliberately, it's not just, quote, nature, this sense of that you're responsible for everything that goes on. An example of this is the Oostvaardersplassen, which is a 23 square mile area of the Netherlands, which is being restored to basically ancient Europe. And they're doing it with mega herbivores. By the way, I'm a mesofauna, I think, as are we all. The mega herbivores they're bringing in are things like heck cattle, pretty ancient looking horses. They wouldn't want to get them more ancient. And various rare species are showing up. Well, here's the deal that they're discovering with the herbivores, which is that they're not usually, their populations are not limited by predation in the real world. In the real world, their populations are limited by who makes it through the winter. In other words, who starves and doesn't starve. Well, here's a little problem. This is a made park. There's a lot of animal lovers in the Netherlands and in Europe who are saying, tell me one more time in your park you're letting animals starve? Well, yeah, because it's being like wilderness Europe before we were here. Yeah, but we are here, and you're letting these animals suffer for how many months before they die of starvation? That won't ride. So the workaround on that was they can figure out by late fall pretty much what animals are going to make it, who's staggering around. And so they go out with high-powered rifles and shoot the staggering animals so that they die now instead of later and don't suffer for 6 months. It turned out this is only acceptable in the Netherlands if a veterinarian is standing by with his arms folded. With all of those accommodations, then it's okay to have a quasi-wilderness herbivore situation in Europe. That kind of thing is going to keep coming up. So they harm beloved somethings, or they suffer in a way that It's okay for us in the wild, but it's not the wild anymore. This is Anthropocene ecology we're talking about. It's a different world. Okay, so hey, here's a great thing. They're going to be like the mountain gorillas of Rwanda. They're going to draw the ecotourists in. We're going to want to see. I mean, you know that every birdwatcher who has a life list is going to have to add the passenger pigeon to the life list, or the Carolina parakeet, or the great auk, or whoever else gets brought back. They will show up and pay handsome money just to be there, and restoration money goes into protecting the wildlands and the habitat and restoring it, using the animal to help restore the habitat, all of that. That's the happy story. Hilary Bach has referred to mammoths and malls. This is a trivialization, can be. You're turning everything into a weird kind of Disneyland. Theme park scene, Pleistocene park indeed. What's the ticket price for your park? And there's a crass commercialization possibility here. And so the evidence you look for is I would say, is the wildland being protected better with or without these extinct iconic animals? Go back to complaints, they're more fun. Stewart Pym wrote a whole long thing for National Geographic saying you can't bring the passenger pigeon back, its habitat is gone. And apparently there's a standard understanding in the world that conservationists are responsible for, which is people think that nature is broken as an incredibly, it's gone. And so you can't bring back great auk because there's no fish left in the North Atlantic. You can't bring back the woolly mammoth because people don't remember where the woolly mammoths live. Actually, there's quite a lot of boreal forest and tundra, which they can turn back into mammoth steppe, and so they'll probably be fine. But the general notion is that the world has changed too much. But look, when the passenger pigeons went extinct, 1880 was the period of maximum deforestation in the Midwest and the East. It was also the period of maximum hunting. That combination was lethal. Since then, the forest has grown back so much, the white-tailed deer that are occupying it are driving people absolutely batshit on the East Coast. And basically, the woods are back. And a lot of those are oaks and beech, which are food trees for passenger pigeons. They were hunted to death. Most of the animals that went extinct, it's turning out, is not from loss of habitat, but from basically being hunted, either by us or especially on islands by invasive species that we introduced. They're predators that chew up everything, rats and goats and pigs and brown tree snakes. And then there's the one best line in Jurassic Park. The Jeff Goldblum character says, life finds a way. Well, life does find a way. And in many of these cases, the species that come back, not all species will make it back. But the ones that make it back will surprise you by how they make it back, I'm pretty sure. And so, they'll thrive or they won't. Another surprising notion to me is the idea that these will become destructively invasive. And again, the mongoose story and the cane toad story is so widespread that people are persuaded that nature is incredibly fragile. And you really mustn't do anything novel or weird to it, or it will just shatter. But what people who study invasive species know is that most species don't invade successfully. Of those that do invade successfully, a very small portion are actually, in any sense, pathological or problematic. And the likelihood that a species that used to live in the area would be somehow pathological this time around is a very odd notion. The rest of it is, and you see this with, say, the American chestnut, which we're trying to bring back on the East Coast, you want it to be, quote, invasive in the neutral ecological term. Ed Wilson's one of our advisors, and he says you may not use invasive terminology in a positive way ever. We went to a lot of trouble to make sure everybody understands it's a negative thing. You want to prevent invasiveness. So Peter Green from Nature Conservancy came up with the term resurgent. Resurgent is good. Invasive bad, resurgent good. So, okay, just call the success of the animal you're trying to get back in the wild resurgent. We are trying to get California condors back so they thrive and abound and reproduce on their own and are not being subject to lead poisoning from the lead that's in the bullets the hunters are still using. The carcasses are being eaten by the birds, and then they have to be taken back to the zoo and collated to get the lead out of there. It's a horrible ongoing cost. But all you got to do is get the lead out of the bullets, and the condors will do fine. So all of this is the kind of finer-grained discourse, ideas that you want to have out there. And I think this process of figuring out how a well-structured cautionary vigilance can work, and then making it actually work, it's something Long Now is going to try to develop and then possibly deploy as something that we perform, because one of the things that institution, like Stanford and some others, is that we are trying to specialize in longevity and continuity and follow through. And follow through is what makes vigilance work, so that when things turn out to have not been a problem, everybody knows, take that one off the list. But if you want to worry, and there's always reasons to worry, here's some reasonable things to worry about. So you move the public discourse with the emerging reality through time. That's the idea here. What would you like to talk about? We've got another 8 minutes or so. Questions, comments?
So I was wondering, I agree with you that most species don't become invasive, but to me, the reason for worrying about the possibility that they will isn't that that's overwhelmingly likely in the case of any given species, but that when it does occur, as in the case of zebra mussels or the starling, it's really bad and bad for an existing ecosystem. So why wouldn't the right principle be to say you need to have a good reason for introducing a species, whether it had been extinct or not, into a range where it didn't previously exist?
I think you want two things, Hilary. One is a good reason, and another one is a sense of reversibility. So that, for example, if it turns out that passenger pigeons are a vector for a disease that you really don't want in the world, they were easy to kill the first time, they'd be easy to kill the second time. Or it could well be that they're only a vector if they get to a certain level of population and you find out what that level is and you pare them back. Because what we're finding with Anthropocene ecology generally is it's stewardship all the way down now. And humans have more power than we really want in nature, more power than we really know how to use properly yet, but we are learning how to use it properly. And conservation biologists keep shocking me with the levels of gardening that they're all discovering that proper conservation involves, and that's just going to keep increasing. So these are exactly the kind of concerns I think you want to nail in front, specify how to identify a problem early and how to respond to the problem that turns up. Yeah. Ben Novak.
Oh, hello. I was really happy, Stewart, to see the evidence column that you put up. And I really didn't know where to fit my comments into the entire day at some point in time, and I think this is now the appropriate space, is you put up a lot of, projected evidence. And I think, especially outside the academic community as well as within, we tend to disregard in all of these questions the facts that we already have evidence of a lot of characteristics to these extinct species and their ecosystems. And we very rarely get to bring those up. One thing that's been evident in the entire time I've been working for you guys is that people really don't understand the bird that I work with, the passenger pigeon. There's actually some inaccuracies just in Hank's article that we all got handed out today. But what we really need out of establishing these questions is, first, everyone understanding the basis of what evidence we already have. And so I would push for everyone actually delving into these things, not because of their questions, but to actually generate better questions as well. That's it.
Sounds good. One of the things we want to do with this framework, probably on our website, is to have a whole portion of the Revive and Restore website dedicated to building the cautionary framework, vigilance framework for de-extinction, and focusing specifically on certain animals as well, so that people see it, they respond to it, and will adjust it as questions come up. And you can, to the extent, this is a very important point we haven't really thought through yet, is how much evidence is already there. So people who say there's no habitat for passenger pigeons, well, that can be answered now. We don't have to wait 10 years, things like that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Terry Root, and I'm the one from biology.
Thank you.
And I also am with the Woods Institute for the Environment. And I work on how plants and animals are affected by climate change. So I'm new to all of this. But you said something in your talk, and you didn't elaborate on it. And I wanted to ask you if you please would do that. You'd said something about how all of this can actually help endangered species. Can you expand that a little bit more and explain why and how? Because I don't see that.
There's two imagined avenues so far. One is probably pretty certain, and it's basically molecular biology level, which is that one of the great problems for seriously endangered animals is that they have very small populations.
Yes.
And there's a genetic bottleneck, low variability, and what Stan Temple, who will speak shortly, refers to as extinct alleles that they need. Now, those extinct alleles are in the frozen zoo, possibly in viable DNA, or in museum specimens in ancient DNA. And those populations could be enriched genetically and given much greater fecundity, which is what you need to get out of the small population situation. In some cases where there's not even any breeding pairs left, like the northern white rhinoceros, you might be able to start building their population and their variability back to the point where they can start expanding on their own. The other avenue is an ecological one, where if the animal you're bringing back is seen as, in some sense, a keystone species, that means it was doing something that enabled a lot of other species to live there. So beaver are being brought back after no end of negotiation in Scotland. As beaver come back to Scotland, they were not, they're not extinct, obviously. They're locally extinct. They're in Europe, but they're not in Scotland. Scotland is this really depauperate highlands world. They're trying to bring back their forest, and if they bring back the locally extinct beaver, they will get beaver ponds and a ferocious amount of biodiversity that goes with the beaver ponds, as well as doing good things like charging the aquifer and so on. So to the extent that an animal is missed by the local ecosystem, and it would be enriched, not only in terms of that species, but other species that would be helped. That's the one hoped for byproduct of bringing the animal back to the wild.
Great. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Yes, sir.
You can count me in among the skeptics. I don't think it's fair to call me a troll, however. I think that was a little unnecessary. It seems to me this entire process that you've got here, which is in itself is quite logical, and quite educational, is based on the assumption that it's going to happen, that you're going to do it. You, someone, we, in fact, in a broader sense, are going to recreate simulacra of extinct species. And if we do that, this is an interesting process for evaluating it along the way. I certainly see that. I actually don't see an argument in there for doing it.
At all.
I would, yeah, and but before you answer that, I could see a more consistently logical argument for saying we're in the Anthropocene, we are making the world, we are going to. You talked about a keystone species. What would be there would be the question.
In terms of nature, it's fair to say we're trying to stop unmaking the world. It's a little different.
Okay, I can
sorry.
see that, I think. But it actually, in a way, comes back to the process or results question, that I'm not sure I'd agree with it, but I could see an argument for saying that we need this ecological niche filled, which for historical reasons is currently not being filled, and we're going to make it. But
I love the idea of a technological niche. I've never heard that.
ecological.
No, I like technological, but you're right, ecological niche doesn't need to be filled. Look, I think the continuum with endangered species is so great that we might as well treat these potentially revivable extinct species as basically exceptionally endangered species. And the passenger pigeon is so endangered, all we have left is some museum specimens. But we have 1,500 museum specimens. It's not nothing. A lot of genetic variability in there. But the continuum is important because it's the same question as why protect endangered species? You know, God obviously is not patient with their sticking around. They're on their way out. We're putting enormous money and effort into what could be spent on better things, trying to protect the last of whatever the hell it is, and some of them seem pretty trivial. But we do it, and we do it for various reasons. We do it to maintain biodiversity. Well, we bring back extinct species for the same reason. We do it because we don't want to be party to a death that large. When something goes extinct, it hits us in the marrow. And so the IUCN has this whole red book of things that are on the brink of that level of death. And Kate may talk about, you know, in a sense, we're adding another category to the red list, which is potential candidate for revival. It's not only extinct in the wild, it's extinct in the world. But its DNA is not extinct. And so that continuum is, I think, one of the things that's emerging from this. There's nothing that special about the woolly mammoth such that bringing back the woolly mammoth means you don't care about protecting African elephants. The more you think about bringing back the woolly mammoth, the more you do care about protecting African elephants. And you use some of the same technology for both.